Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the history of New York City. We've got a ton of research and articles ready to go, and to help us through it, we have an expert on the subject.
Glad to be here.
Yeah.
New York City's history is so interesting, a blend of ambition and resilience and change. I'm excited to get started.
I bet you've got some great stories. Before we get into it, I have a question for you and for our listeners. When do you think the first Europeans set foot in New York Harbor?
That's a good question to start with. The answer usually surprises people. It actually wasn't Henry Hudson, as many assume. It was actually an Italian explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano back in 1524. He even claimed the area for France and called it Nouvelle Angoulême.
New York City with a French accent, imagine that. How to go from Nouvelle Angoulême to New Amsterdam and then finally New York City.
Well, it's a long and winding road. A few years after Verrazzano, a Spanish expedition led by a Portuguese captain, Esteban Gomes, charted the Hudson River and named it Rio de San Antonio. Even the Hudson had a totally different name back then.
It's like peeling back layers of history. It really makes you realize how much we just don't think about the names and stories that shape a place.
Yeah, and speaking of names, even the Hudson River had a few names before we landed on the one we use today. Henry Hudson himself, while looking for a northwest passage to the Orient in 1609, named it the Mauritius. Then the Dutch started calling it the North River. It wasn't until later that it was officially called the Hudson River.
Okay, so the French, the Spanish, and the English were all here. But if I remember correctly, it was the Dutch who actually established the first European presence, right?
You're right. In 1624, they set up a fur trading settlement on Governor's Island. That makes New York the 12th oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental U.S. People are always surprised by that.
Older than many people think, for sure. So the Dutch were in it for the fur trade. Did they plan on building a city, or was it more of a gradual thing?
It was a little of both. In 1625, they started building a citadel and Fort Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. This would become New Amsterdam, which would become New York City.
It's amazing to think about those early settlers laying the foundation for what would become such an iconic city. What were some of the big challenges they faced early on?
Attracting settlers was a big one. To try and incentivize people to settle, they created the patroon system in 1628. So wealthy Dutchmen who brought 50 colonists were given land and some political autonomy, but it didn't really work out like they planned.
So even back then, it wasn't easy getting people to move to New York.
No, not really. And of course, we have the fur trade itself. The Dutch West India Company had a monopoly on it for a while. Then they gave it up in 1639, 1640. They hoped it would stimulate growth. This led to expansion in other industries: food, timber, tobacco, and the slave trade with the Dutch West Indies, unfortunately.
So New York, even in those early days, was built on economic ambition.
Yes, and as we go further along in this timeline, you'll see those themes come up again and again.
This is fascinating. Now, for our listeners, I want you to think about this. Knowing New York City could have been French or Spanish, how do you think the city would be different? Think about that while we continue our deep dive.
That's a great question. Makes you think about how small things can really change history.
We've talked about the arrival of Europeans, the Dutch settlement, and the early economics of New York City. What happened next?
Well, we can't forget that New York City was in the middle of tension between the English and the Dutch.
Leading to the English conquest of New Netherland in 1664.
Exactly. New Amsterdam was surrendered to the English without a fight. It was renamed New York to honor the Duke of York. He'd later become King James II.
So it's a peaceful takeover. The English probably wanted to do more than just change the name.
Oh, absolutely. New York City changed a lot under English rule, and those changes continued after the American Revolution. New York became an important part of the new United States.
So the city was evolving into the city we know today. I'm sure there were challenges along the way.
Yeah, definitely. New York's story is full of drama and ambition and resilience. We're about to enter a time of huge growth, plus some political maneuvering, and even some dark times for the city.
Okay, I'm ready to hear more. Let's take a quick break so our listeners can think about what we've learned so far.
Good point. There are a lot of fascinating details, but it's good to step back and look at the big picture.
So while we get ready for the next part of our deep dive into New York City, here's something to think about. How do you think the Dutch heritage of the city still shapes it today? We'll be back soon to explore more of this incredible city.
So as we get into the 19th century, New York City is becoming a major player in American politics and economics.
That makes sense. The location and that amazing harbor made it perfect for trade.
Right. But there's this interesting connection with the South during this time that a lot of people don't know about. The Democratic Party had a lot of power in New York City, and they had strong ties to the South.
So even though New York was in the north, it had some southern leanings.
Yeah, history is rarely black and white. It all culminated in 1861 when Mayor Fernando Wood suggested that New York City secede from the Union.
Wait, the mayor wanted to join the Confederacy?
It was a bold idea, but it shows how divided the country was leading up to the Civil War.
The city must have been full of tension back then.
Definitely. And all that tension played a part in one of the darkest times for New York City, the draft riots of 1863.
The draft riots, they were sparked by the conscription laws, right?
Yes. A lot of working-class New Yorkers, especially Irish immigrants, felt like the laws were unfair. Wealthier people could pay to get out of military service. The riots were really bad. There was looting, arson, and attacks on government buildings.
And black residents were also targeted.
Yes, sadly. 11 black men were lynched. Hundreds more had to flee Manhattan.
It's hard to believe that even in a diverse city like New York, that much hate could exist.
It's a reminder that prejudice and inequality can happen anywhere. But in the middle of all this, in 1886, came a symbol of hope, the Statue of Liberty.
Lady Liberty. It represented freedom and opportunity for so many immigrants coming to Ellis Island.
For those tired travelers, it was a sign of a new life.
And then, just a few years later, in 1898, New York City went through a big change. Brooklyn, parts of the Bronx, Richmond County, and Western Queens all became one city, New York City.
The 5 boroughs. Bringing those areas together must have been difficult.
Like fitting different puzzle pieces together.
Yeah. But one thing that helped to unify the city was the New York City subway, which opened in 1904.
The subway, it connects millions of people every day.
It's a great example of engineering. It let people move easily between the boroughs.
So infrastructure can change not just the way a city looks, but how people connect. In the 20th century, New York City went through a lot of social, cultural, and political changes.
Right. And New York has always been a place where those things happen. One example is the Stonewall riots in 1969.
That was a big moment for LGBTQ plus rights.
It happened at the Stonewall Inn. The police raided the bar, which was common back then, but this time the people fought back. It turned into days of protests.
And that started the modern LGBTQ plus rights movement.
It did. But while the 60s saw progress, the 70s were tough for the city. There were economic problems and crime was up.
It sounds like a hard time for the city.
It was. The city needed help, but President Ford refused to give them financial aid. That's when that Ford to City drop dead headline came out.
That must have hurt.
But New York is resilient. By the mid-90s, crime started going down. The financial industry was doing better, and people kept moving to the city.
It's like the city always finds a way to come back.
That's a good way to put it. But then on September 11th, 2001, something terrible happened that changed the city forever.
The September 11th attacks were a horrible tragedy for the city and the whole nation.
So many innocent people died. But even with all that sadness, we saw people helping each other and rebuilding.
It shows how strong the people of New York are. We've gone through so much of New York's history, from a Dutch trading post to a global city. What about the city now? What makes the 5 boroughs unique?
We'll talk about that as we keep going, but before that, I want you to think about something. We've seen how New York has faced so many challenges. What do you think makes it so resilient?
It really makes you think. What is it about this city? Let's talk about what makes each borough unique. Where should we start?
We could start in Manhattan. It's the most densely populated. It's got those big skyscrapers, world-class museums, and a really energetic feel. Manhattan is the financial center of the world, home to Wall Street. It's global. Commerce, culture, innovation.
Manhattan, the city that never sleeps. But what about Brooklyn? Seems like it's a popular place to live these days.
Brooklyn is definitely having a moment. Most populous borough,
Right.
known for its bridges, and its art scene is huge. The neighborhoods are also different. You've got trendy areas, historic brownstones, parks for families.
And Queens, it's the largest borough, right? What makes it special?
Queens is a mix of urban and suburban. It's incredibly diverse. It's the most ethnically diverse county in the entire U.S. So much food and culture there. Plus, it's got JFK and LaGuardia, so it's a gateway to the rest of the world.
Staten Island seems a little more removed from all the other boroughs.
Staten Island is definitely more suburban, more relaxed. It's connected to Brooklyn and Manhattan by the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge and the Staten Island Ferry. You get amazing views of the city from the ferry.
And the Bronx. It seems like it's coming back in a big way.
The Bronx is definitely on the rise, the only borough on the mainland. Home to Yankee Stadium, the New York Botanical Garden, the Bronx Zoo, Rich history in music and the arts, really important to hip-hop culture.
Each borough really does have its own personality. New York also has those amazing parks.
Absolutely. Central Park is an oasis in the middle of the city. It was really forward-thinking to build such a big park in a big city. Millions of people go there every year, walking, biking, concerts, art exhibitions. But did you know Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx is 3 times bigger than Central Park?
Wow, I had no idea. So if you need a break from the city, you've got options.
Yeah. And then there's the Staten Island Greenbelt, a network of parks and trails, one of the last forests in the city. Nature can still exist even in a place like New York.
What about the weather? New York is known for extreme weather, right?
New York has a humid subtropical climate, so hot, humid summers and cold, wet winters. The city's a little warmer in the winter than other cities at the same latitude. The Atlantic Ocean moderates the temperature. But yeah, the summers are hot and the winters are cold.
Hurricanes are a concern too, right? Hurricane Sandy was pretty bad.
Hurricane Sandy was rough, flooding, power outages, billions of dollars in damage. It really showed how vulnerable the city is to bad weather. It made people think about climate change and how to protect the coast.
Those are important conversations to have. So we've talked about history, the boroughs, the parks,
Yeah.
the weather. What else makes New York City special? Any hidden gems or surprising facts?
Well, for one, New York City has really pure drinking water. It comes from the Catskill Mountains. They don't even have to filter it.
That's amazing. Clean water right out of the tap. Not many cities can say that.
Yeah.
Anything else?
We have to mention how diverse New York City is. People from all over the world live here. It's got the largest Asian Indian population in the Western Hemisphere, largest Jewish population of any city in the world, and the largest African American, Dominican American, and Puerto Rican American populations in the U.S.
It's like a microcosm of the world.
And don't forget about public transportation. More than half of New Yorkers use mass transit.
Right, most people don't even own a car.
Yeah, only like 22% of people in Manhattan have a car. The subway, buses, and ferries are how people get around. And of course, New York is a center for media and entertainment. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, tons of TV and film studios, Broadway.
New York City. Always moving. Always something going on. It's been amazing learning about this city.
New York is amazing, despite everything it's been through. New York was voted the most resilient city in the world in 2021 and 2022.
It seems like resilience is part of what makes New York, New York.
As we finish our deep dive into New York City, I hope you all learned something. It's a city with a rich history and a vibrant culture and an amazing spirit.
It has been a really interesting deep dive. Thanks for joining us.